Welcome to the Ask the Experts panel. My name is Ryan Vesely. I am the Vice President of Customer Success and Technical Services here at Sauce, which means I get to do a lot of work with a lot of different interesting people, many of which are on this call right now. So I think maybe to kind of get us started, before we get into any of the specific questions, it would be great if, since we are talking to the experts, to understand what makes you experts. So if you could each introduce yourselves briefly. Marcus, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm Marcus Merrell. I'm the Senior Director of Field Services here at Sauce Labs. And I guess I'm an expert because I've been involved with Selenium project since 2008, literally the day it was announced. Webdriver, at least, that is.
I think that qualifies you. Just going around the horn on my screen. Titus, we'll go with you next.
Yeah, I'm Titus Fortner. I have been working at Sauce Labs for 3.5 years. Before I joined Sauce, I was a software development engineer and test at 5 different companies. I'm a core contributor to the Selenium project. I'm the project lead for Water, which is a test library based on Selenium. So lots of different coding experience in a lot of different contexts.
Great. Jane, how about you?
Hi, I'm Jane MacNeil. I'm the Director of Engagements here at Sauce. And so I help our customers design and develop programs that help them realize the value of automation.
Perfect. Josh?
Hi, everyone. Excuse me. I am Josh Grant. I am a solution architect at Sauce Labs. I've been working in test automation for over 10 years now. I've been working as a solution architect at Sauce Labs for over 2 years, and I've worked with a bunch of different test automation technologies, similar to Titus, Python, JavaScript, Selenium, a whole whack of stuff. So yeah, happy to be answering questions today.
Perfect. And last but not least, Nikolay.
Hey, everyone. I'm also a solution architect here at Sauce Labs. And I've been in the IT industry since 2008, and I've been teaching test automation and blogging about it since 2013.
Perfect. Well, so it definitely sounds like each and every one of you has your unique experiences and bring your own thoughts to the session. So I have a couple of questions myself I'd like to get us started on, but hopefully the audience here will chime in as well with some other questions that have come up. And I think just knowing that each of you are dealing primarily with working with the implementation side of things and kind of getting people using various different strategies when it comes to test, it might be worthwhile to kind of pause for a second and just kind of talk about the overall industry. And Marcus, as the leader of the group, I'd like to start with you specifically. There's been a lot of discussion and activity in the industry around Selenium 4 and the various different protocols that come along with that. Could you talk a little bit about what that means and really kind of what people should be thinking about for that protocol and for that standard? And then maybe even go into some discussion about what they should be thinking about getting ready.
All right, you might have to remind me of that list once again. But yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. Mainly what I'm hoping is that what people actually need to know about Selenium 4 is that the maintainers, the creators of Selenium in general have been rather obsessive about backward compatibility. So in theory, not much will change in your actual code between Selenium 3, Selenium 2 even, and Selenium 4. The interface is staying roughly the same. The thing that is changing is that we've had this seismic shift in the last 8 years where Selenium used to be kind of a project full of OSS contributors with a lot of moxie who created this connective tissue to be able to work on web browsers and connect to it and control it. And what's happened is we've actually turned the WebDriver standard into a spec, which is now produced and followed by the browser vendors themselves. So it used to be that the community created the connective tissue between IE and Chrome and Edge and Firefox to your code. Now that stuff is being done by Microsoft and Mozilla and Google. And the release of Selenium 4 is a ratification of that standard, which means that at some point, those browser vendors are going to pull support for the older way, the pre-vendor takeover mechanism, the protocol, and that stuff won't work anymore, which means that if you're using Chrome 76, Chrome 85, at some point, you won't be able to upgrade and keep your old code in place. So you're going to have to change a little bit about how you instantiate your driver in order to carry that forward to the new standard.
Is that a big change that they have to do, or is it relatively minor?
It should be a relatively minor change, assuming kind of a properly developed framework and a proper abstraction. And we could even let Titus talk about this a little bit more. It should be a fairly simple change.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of keyed in there on some solid prerequisites around frameworks and various different pieces with that. Titus, he tossed you the ball. Please go ahead, comment on that.
Well, yeah, from a user standpoint, it should mostly just work. I mean, the principle of how Selenium versions itself is supposed to be the latest version of Selenium 3. Everything that you can do in Selenium 3.x, you should be able, or everything you could do in Selenium 4.0, you should be able to do in the last version of 3.0 or 3.141.59, because that's how we version things in Selenium. But yeah, it's been a lot of work on the developer side, which is why it's taking so long to release it, because the project is completely redoing the build system, the backend stuff for the grid. And so it's not just removing the old JSON wire protocol. There's a lot of other things that are going into that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about W3C stuff when I talk about some framework things in an upcoming session.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like what you're saying there is that there are some things that need to be taken care of. There are some updates that need to happen. Is this an all or nothing type of thing? Does every group within an organization have to be doing the exact same thing, or can they take a more piecemeal approach to this?
They should be able to. It depends on the team structure and whether or not they're sharing code. Every sort of framework should centralize around one method of creating a WebDriver. That nugget of code is what needs to be changed. It's usually at most 8 to 10 lines of code where it will center around, and usually there's only 1 or 2 lines that have to change. Maybe somewhere between 1 and 10, I think is a fairly good swag. But Sauce supports sessions for both, so it should just be one change in any given framework or team or however the code is organized. It's not a tremendous amount of work. But
I guess I should say real quick, if I can, that the Sauce Labs users, there are certain things that they have to do in order to use W3C with Selenium 4. And so there is some work if you're still using an old approach. It'll work on your Selenium 3.141.59 code, but it's going to be necessary in order to update to 4.0. And we'll talk about some of that in the Sauce bindings talk as well.
Perfect. I think that's great. It's a good kind of thing to keep in mind, that there are some large industry-wide events that are happening that we have to be mindful of as we shape our various different strategies and test programs. But there's also probably a lot of very minute things that can be done down at the nuts and bolts level, if you will. And I guess I'll ask this question of either Nikolay or Josh. You guys can fight over who wants to answer. What are some of what I would call low-hanging fruit things that people tend to maybe miss when they first start getting implemented, that when you come in and you start working with them, what are the things that you say, oh, you know what, you should really think about doing this because it's going to change your world and it's really easy for you to do?
Go ahead, Josh.
All right. I'll start. Thank you for that. So one thing I've really noticed working with a lot of customers at Sauce Labs, and full disclosure, before I worked at Sauce Labs, I didn't ever use a cloud provider. So I never used Sauce. I used internal grids. I used like AWS style setups, but I didn't use a cloud provider like Sauce. So one thing that's becoming really, really obvious to me is that when everything is local, or when everything's on your own internal network, wire calls, like Selenium calls, are very cheap and fast. So people can get, I don't want to say sloppy, but they don't think about using different wire calls, like finding an element multiple times before interacting with it, or I'm just going to loop looking for a page title or something many, many times. It doesn't matter, because if everything's local, that'll add maybe like a fraction of a second to your test. Once you go on to a cloud provider and you're sending those wire calls like over the internet and over the various networks in the cloud and all this other stuff, those calls actually do add up, and you take a big performance hit. So that's something that a lot of users run into at first, and they wonder, why are my tests so slow? And we take a look and you say, well, you're calling this find element 3 times when you don't need to. And if you repeat that many places in your page objects or in your tests, those performance degradations add up. So, I mean, that's one thing that I've noticed.
I can also add another thing to that. that pretty much kind of what Josh mentioned. I was actually going to talk about something similar as well. The other thing that stands out to me is I feel like individuals or teams are not leveraging parallelization early enough. And I guess it makes sense in terms of the reasoning why we kind of start building out our automation suite. And then at some point we hit a barrier where it's too slow, right? And we say, okay, this is enough. I need to figure out a way to make it faster. But I want to recommend to start doing parallelization earlier. I always try to recommend, say, when you have two tests and they're running, start running them in parallel right there. Because, for example, let's say you can run 15 or even 20 threads in parallel. If you can run 20 threads in parallel, whether it's on your local environment or in a cloud provider, what that allows you is if you have a test that's a minute long and that's your longest test, every test you add afterwards, as long as it's not longer than a minute, your entire suite will take 1 minute to run. So you're basically getting 20 tests added for free for the price of one. And so that's the power of parallelization. And then, of course, if you introduce it earlier, you don't have to overcome other technical challenges, such as, for example, let's say you coded your framework with a static WebDriver. When you have hundreds or thousands of tests using that static WebDriver, it'll be much harder to refactor to do parallelization at that point than it would have been 2 tests in when you only have to change, a little bit of code.
Good stuff.
Okay. So it sounds like there's, like I said before, there's the fine tuning of things that are going on a day-to-day basis where your teams are working together and making sure that they're set up properly and they have the various different test strategies there. And then of course there's the industry-wide types of things that are going on with that. Bringing that all together, especially if you're working with a bunch of different teams, can be difficult. And really, to me, like that, just talking to various different customers, to me, that sounds a lot like program management and being mindful of what's going on in that space. So Jane, as the director of the services here that we're talking about, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about when you think about program management, what are the things that you want your customers to be mindful of, and how do you coach them to kind of get those things started?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tactical things that people can get engaged with that will help them develop programs that are really successful around structure and processes in their organizations that they want to develop. But for me, I think that the easiest thing to do is to just be super collaborative with your colleagues and have a really good, clear sense of decision-making and motivation and things that you want to get across. So a lot of the stuff that Nikolay and Josh were just talking about with parallelization requires quite a bit of like maintenance and structure and things that people have to be quite thoughtful about. If you're working with teams that are constantly evaluating these things, you're going to develop something that's much more manageable. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of formal things that you can do, and it's good to be very clear with your organizations about what you're setting out to do and who's responsible for doing things and what you guys are trying to achieve. But to also be a little bit flexible and to come together and kind of make decisions as a team collaboratively.
Great. So actually, it's good that we're talking about teams, because one of the questions that was just posted in our group here, and by the way, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but for those that are watching, please feel free, submit your own questions, and we can absolutely answer those here as well. But Nikolay, this one kind of goes back to you and some of the things that you were just talking about around thinking about parallelization and making sure that resources are available. The question really talks about what happens when you have a lot of different teams fighting for those resources to encourage parallelization? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. That's actually a really good question, because it tends to happen a lot, right? It's funny that in today's day and age, even though hardware resources are so cheap, we still have teams kind of fighting over it. But so that's where the things that Josh was mentioning come into play, where if, for example, your tests are really long and have lots of WebDriver calls, that impacts the entire organization and all the teams fighting for the concurrency because your tests are taking 10, 15 minutes to execute. Those teams are now being slowed down by that execution. And so now it's really important to get into the weeds and figure out why your tests are so slow, making them faster, making them autonomous, so that, for example, let's say you have a suite that can run in 30 seconds or a minute. then sharing those resources becomes much easier, because now multiple teams are having suites that can execute faster. You can utilize way less resources. And I think that's one of the key components of being able to share those resources, is making sure that your stuff is optimized, even doing stuff like testing at lower layers of the automation pyramid, right? It's so funny because we all work at Sauce Labs, but I feel like, and the other solution architects can agree with me or disagree, that one of the main things we encourage is to test less at the UI layer. That's probably one of the main things we keep repeating our customers. It's like, hey, let's figure out a way how we can help you do more the API layer and the unit layer, so that you can be more efficient with your parallelization, with your testing, and then ultimately you'll be more successful as a customer.
Yeah, we particularly find customers operating in the UI to do test data management and setup, and that's the piece that we're on, kind of like a career-long crusade to say that stuff needs to be done in the API if possible. So
great.
Yeah.
And actually, I know that this is an Ask the Experts panel, and it's probably going to be, well, I'll just say it. I just want to make sure that we have it out there. You use two terms, Nikolay, that I want to make sure the audience is aware of. You mentioned autonomous, and then you mentioned atomic. Can you just define those, just to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what we're talking about?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So autonomous, what that ultimately means is that a test should be independent of the execution of other tests. So if you run test 1 followed by test 2, the outcome of test 2 should not be reliant on test 1, right? So if test 1 fails, test 2 should not fail as well, because now it's failing for an invalid reason. And atomic means that it's testing only a single functionality. So a lot of things that we try to encourage our customers, for example, after a login, they may have some other functionality that they are testing, but if they have to go through all these steps through the login and the UI, and then they're doing validations along the way, if those validations fail, now the functionality that you were really trying to test is not being tested. And that's because the test is not atomic.
Great, thank you. All right, so we're starting to get some good questions now. And at the risk of just inciting a fight amongst all of you about your opinions, I'm going to ask some of these just to see what happens here. So the first question, is Webdriver IO a good framework to use? Who wants to answer that?
So the short answer is yes.
I think we're unanimous on that.
Yeah, the slightly longer answer is if you're in Node.js, or you're in like a context where you can make use of Node.js or like modern frameworks, yes. Yeah, I mean, to me, so WebDriver IO is really good because not just is it comparable to just using like the Selenium WebDriver with Java or with C# or something, it has a real good feel for developer experience. It's designed, its APIs are designed in a way that are highly usable, they're maintainable. Integration points are really carefully thought of. So if you want to add a certain kind of reporting, if you want to use Sauce Labs, those integration points are really good. They're really well thought out, and you get a lot of bang for your buck. So yeah, I mean that's my 2 cents on WebDriver IO, and why it's good.
So there's more, and I'm going to go ahead and keep them asking. And Titus, I'm going to throw this one at you because, well, you've been quiet for a bit. So if you don't know, feel free to pass it on, just not back to me because I won't know. The question is, what are your opinions on using Jeb or Spock or Selenium for writing various different automation tests at scale?
So Spock is a test runner. Jeb is a wrapper for Selenium, based in Groovy. And I love the idea of Groovy because it's like Ruby, except for it runs in Java without having to do JRuby. But Spock does not parallelize very well. And so we've had a lot of problems running Jeb, getting Jeb to work the way that would be optimal on Sauce Labs. So if you don't, if there are alternatives, typically I would recommend those. Just because you're going to be fighting it a little bit. And, Jeb's a great idea, but it hasn't taken off quite, like Groovy itself hasn't really taken off the way that might have been nice at one point. And that's just a wrapper on top of Selenium. And just to add something, I guess, to the WebDriver IO, Selenium is important to keep in mind that Selenium is just a browser automation tool. It is the robot that drives specific interactions with the driver. It's very do what I say kind of an approach. And things like Jeb and things like Water and things like Webdriver IO put a little bit more opinions in there and try and do what I mean a little bit more. And from a tester standpoint, you need a do what I mean interaction with your code, or else you're going to be writing way more code than you should be in a way more complicated fashion than you should be. So you need something, and that's one of the good reasons for WebDriver IO or Water or Capybara or any of the number of various libraries out there.
Okay, so there's knowing that we're starting to enter into the tail end of this conversation, I do want to throw one out there, kind of along what you were just talking about, and see if we can get everybody having an opinion on this one. So a long time ago, I used to be technical. Now I'm not as much technical. I'm more focused on the business side of things and kind of understanding what the expectations are for a user to use a system. So I think about things like, what are the outcomes that I want that user to do? More of like what are the business drivers of that? I've talked to a lot of different testers, and they're oftentimes focused more on the functional side or the very specific outcomes that they want that given test to provide. And what you end up having, from what I've seen at least, is that you kind of have two different schools of thought start to emerge, TDD or BDD. And I'm just kind of curious.
I'm going to step
on
out.
Your experience. Which one do you like better, TDD or BDD?
Well, exclusive.
I believe the famous software developer Winston Churchill once said, "TDD is bad is the worst form of software development except all the other ones." So I think does that answer the question?
Good quote, Josh.
Okay. Jane, do you have an opinion?
I do actually have an opinion, because we work with so many customers that are using this. I mean, they're getting like a mandate from their corporate headquarters to do things that are more aligned with what the business and be more inclusive about those perspectives. So they want to have business analysts and product owners get involved and engaged in that process. And I'm all for that. But I certainly share everybody on this panel's anxiety about how that's actually done and executed in practice, because it tends to create a lot. So people have to be pretty, considerate about how they actually create those assets and how they're maintained. Everything that's created does need to be maintained, and you don't want to go down a path where you're just creating a maintenance exercise for yourself. So, if I was a BA that was getting involved in this process, I'd be stoked. I'd be excited about it, but I would want to make sure that what I was helping build was something that's useful and it's not, duplicating other functionality as well. Which is why I think everybody's very anxious when they see BDD being used, because it just creates so much, right? So yeah, Josh is laughing at me because it's like, yeah, it's a lot. You're creating.
I mean, we are going to have a whole session talking about Cucumber and Josh and Nikolay. So we'll go over that in more detail here soon as well. That'll be
5:40 Eastern time.
That's right.
Perfect. And Jane, thank you for throwing in that translation of the Canadian word stoked. I understand that it means excited. That's a good thing. All right. So one more question came in, and I'm just going to read this one because it's a bit long. So is there an automated way to efficiently run tests only for the impacted functionality of system under test? And how does Sauce Labs help in solving this today? And can you talk about different strategies Sauce would recommend? So if you need me to break that down, I can, but Marcus, it looks like you can answer it.
I'll probably need it broken down because I have the memory of a goldfish. Essentially, we've talked about this, and we have talked to several companies about who are trying to crack this. Essentially, what the Holy Grail, not the Holy Grail, one step short of the Holy Grail. I don't know what you call it. The Holy Dixie Cup of
Free Holy
this
Grail.
kind of thing would be: you make a commit, it analyzes the lines of code that were altered, then figures out which pages on the UI were altered and which backend calls were changed. And then there's a set of tag tests assets on the other end that are saying only these tests will execute as a result of this, because the only risk is that these areas were affected. Now, as far as I can tell, nobody has done it. There's a company called AIQA that is working on it. They seem to be doing a pretty good job. They've got off to a good start. And there's a few others that have entered the space. Nobody's cracked the nut yet. There's a lot of different theories on how to do it. Currently, I would say that we don't offer anything out of the box unless one of my colleagues wants to correct me. But that's a conversation that I've had professionally here with within the company, within our data science group, and also with other companies. As I go to conferences, I seek out the people who are trying to solve this problem in order to apply it to our customers. But it has not been cracked yet.
I mean, I've done this on a more limited scale. Like, I don't like smoke tests because that means the important tests and everything else, we don't care if it fails. And so I hate breaking it up into those two things. I much prefer, if you need faster responses to per commit or per pull request results, put some feature tags on it and say, run all the reservation system tests, run all the inquiry tests. So it's not quite as advanced as which pages changed and which, things changed. But if you're looking to get a fast response, just run a subset of your tests immediately, and then do the full cross-browser, cross-platform tests in the evenings is kind of the approach I recommend.
I've seen people correlate tags on folders within GitHub to tags on tests with tags for JUnit groups with test in G, and correlate the two. That's not too hard a lift. We don't provide that because we don't look at your GitHub ever at this point. But that's the direction that we've been thinking of at this point.
So Marcus, you and I have talked about this in the past, and I think this is kind of where you and Titus were just talking about. There's obviously test, and then there's a whole bunch of other tools around test that relate to software management. One of them obviously being, the monitoring space. So you've got a production line, and traditionally thinking testing is before the production line and monitoring is after the production line. I'm wondering if the things that you're talking about in terms of understanding what's impacted, can monitoring help you with that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, somebody built an integration, a former employee here built an integration between Sentry and Sauce Labs that would actually tie some root cause analysis between an error in production to an error that you see in the Sauce Labs test run, and give you kind of it was working here and then it broke here in test and then it broke in production, correlate those two pieces. I absolutely think that there's a lot of work that could be done. And that's kind of like, we announced products today around the shift left mindset. This is in the shift right mindset, which is where you and I both have talked about a lot. Like, this is where I think the real future is. Shift left is kind of an assumption now. To me, shift right is where the industry will be going at some point, as Matt Wyman said earlier.
So I would love to keep this conversation going. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and we either have been cut off or we're about to be cut off. So I'd like just to thank each and every single one of you for participating. It was a lot of fun. Look forward to talking again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
So much.
Thanks, everybody.